I never thought a birthday party would be the night I finally stopped pretending everything was fine. Not after 17 years of building something I genuinely believed in. A career, a home, 2 kids who thought their dad hung the moon, and a marriage I had poured myself into without reservation. But that Saturday evening in our backyard, surrounded by my wife's friends and the smell of catered food I had arranged and paid for, I heard her laugh at my expense one more time, and something in me went very, very quiet. My name is Daniel Calloway. I'm 44 years old, and I've spent the last 12 years as a trauma surgeon at St. Augustine Medical Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. I know how that sounds. Impressive, disciplined, a man in control. And at work, that's exactly who I am. I make decisions in seconds that determine whether someone lives or dies. My hands don't shake. My voice doesn't waver. I don't second-guess myself in the OR. But at home, for reasons I spent a long time pretending not to understand, I had slowly become someone else entirely. Someone smaller. Someone my wife had quietly, consistently, cheerfully reduced to a running joke. My wife, I'll call her Renata, is a landscape architect. Talented. Genuinely. She runs her own firm out of a studio she converted from our garage, and she has a gift for seeing beauty in spaces that other people walk past without noticing. We met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's dinner party in Raleigh. She was drawing floor plans on a cocktail napkin just to prove a point in an argument about symmetry. I fell for her immediately. We got married 2 years later and moved to Charlotte when I accepted my position at St. Augustine, when our daughter Sophie was born and then our son Marcus 3 years after that. We made the decision together that Renata would scale back her client load to part-time. My salary was more than sufficient. She would be the one who knew the school schedules, the pediatrician appointments, the names of the teachers and the soccer coaches and the kids' best friends' parents. I would carry the financial weight and be as present as my hours allowed. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, but it was ours, and we had agreed to it with open eyes. For the first few years, it worked. But somewhere around the time Marcus started kindergarten, something shifted in how Renata spoke to me, and more importantly, in how she spoke about me to other people. It started the way these things always do, small enough that I told myself I was being oversensitive. The first time I noticed it, I was trying to help Sophie with a school project about ecosystems. I'd been on call for 36 hours, but Sophie had asked me specifically, and I wasn't going to let her down. We were spread out on the kitchen floor with construction paper and markers when Renata walked in, took one look at what we were building, and laughed. "Honey, that's the ocean," she said, pointing to my blue section. "Sophie's project is about desert ecosystems." I looked at the paper. Sophie looked at me. I had completely misread the instructions. "I've got it from here," Renata said, and she sat down next to Sophie and gently redirected everything. Which was fair. She had read the assignment. I hadn't. What wasn't fair was what I heard 20 minutes later when she was on the phone in the hallway with her sister. He'd been awake for a day and a half and he still wanted to help, which is sweet, but he had her building a coral reef for a desert project. I genuinely don't know how this man saves lives at work. Her sister laughed. Renata laughed. I stood in the kitchen doorway and told myself it was just a funny story. Tired surgeon makes silly mistake. Everyone vents to their sisters. I let it go. But I noticed it was getting harder to let things go. A few months later, I took the kids to Marcus's baseball practice while Renata had a client meeting. Routine enough. On the way home, I stopped for drive-thru because I hadn't had time to think about dinner, and the kids were asking. I got them cheeseburgers and chocolate milk, and they were perfectly happy. When we got home, Renata was already back. She looked at the fast food bags and said nothing in that specific way that communicates everything. "Long day," I said. "It's fine," she said. But the way she smiled at the kids, that sympathetic, conspiratorial smile, told me it wasn't entirely fine. That weekend, at a neighborhood cookout, I overheard her telling 2 women I barely knew, "I leave him with the kids for 4 hours, and they come home having eaten nothing but a drive-through cheeseburger and chocolate milk. My son was wired until 11. She shook her head with this affectionate, tired smile. "I love him, but honestly, it's like having a third child sometimes." The women laughed warmly. One of them said, "That's every husband. Don't worry." And Renata nodded like that was exactly right. I was standing close enough to hear every word. She didn't lower her voice because she wasn't embarrassed. She didn't think she was doing anything worth being embarrassed about. I should have said something then. I know that now, but I was already running a calculation I hadn't consciously chosen to run. If I push back, we'll argue. And I only have 2 days off this week, and the kids are right there, and maybe she's right and I'm just tired and reading too much into a throwaway comment at a cookout. So I smiled at someone who said something to me, refilled my drink, and let it pass. Over the following months, I let a lot of things pass. There was the time she told Marcus's pediatrician at the annual checkup, which I had specifically rearranged my surgical schedule to attend. I brought backup today, gesturing at me like I was a marginally useful assistant. The doctor smiled politely. I stared at the wall chart of childhood developmental milestones. There was the time I fixed the garbage disposal, and she told her mother on speakerphone, "Daniel finally fixed it. Only took 3 weeks and 2 YouTube tutorials, but we got there." There was the time I picked Sophie up early from school because she had a fever, brought her home, made her chicken soup from scratch. Actually from scratch, not from a can. Tucked her into the couch with her favorite blanket. And when Renata got home, she looked at the situation, looked at me, and said warmly, "Look at you." The way you'd say it to a golden retriever who had learned a new trick. Each one of those was a paper cut. And I kept telling myself that paper cuts don't matter. Until the night Marcus looked up from his homework and said, completely sincerely, "Dad, are you actually good at stuff at home? Mom says you're better at work stuff." He was 8 years old. He was asking in genuine curiosity, the way kids ask whether the sky is blue or whether dogs can see color. He had been handed a framework for understanding his father, and the framework said, capable at work, lost at home. He wasn't being cruel. He was just reporting back what he'd absorbed. I set down my pen. I looked at my son and said, "I'm good at a lot of things, buddy, including stuff at home." He nodded like he was filing that away as new information. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because I was on call. Because I was lying in the dark doing the arithmetic of the past 2 years and realizing that the sum was something I hadn't given myself permission to name yet. My wife had been quietly, consistently building a version of me. For our children, for our friends, for her family, for casual acquaintances at neighborhood cookouts. That was a lesser version. Not a cruel caricature. Not vicious. Just diminished. Lovably incompetent. Sweetly useless outside of his lane. And I had let her build it because every individual brick seemed too small to make a fuss about. I brought it up 3 days later. I waited until the kids were in bed and Renata was in the kitchen with a glass of wine and her iPad. And I sat down across from her and said I needed to talk about something. She put down the iPad, which I appreciated. "I've noticed a pattern," I said, "in how you talk about me, to the kids, to your friends, to your mom. The jokes about me not knowing how things work at home. The comments about me being useless outside the hospital. It's been going on for a while and it's starting to bother me." Renata looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You're serious right now?" "Yes." She leaned back. "Daniel, I'm not trying to hurt you. It's just, you have to admit, sometimes you are a little helpless with domestic stuff. It's not mean, it's just true." "It's not true," I said. "And even when I make mistakes, you don't have to announce them to whoever's nearby." "I'm not announcing anything, I'm just being real with people. It's called being relatable. Every wife talks about their husband like this. I don't care about every husband. I care about us." She sighed in a way that told me she had already decided this conversation was an overreaction. "You work 60 hours a week? I run this household? Sometimes I vent. That's normal. Venting to your sister is one thing. Telling Marcus I'm better at work stuff is something else." She paused at that one. For just a second, something crossed her face. Then, he's a kid. He's not going to remember a throwaway comment. "He asked me if I was actually good at things at home," I said. He used the word actually. He's already absorbed it. She didn't have an answer for that. But she didn't admit it meant anything either. She picked up her wine, looked at me with tired patience, and said, "I think you're really stressed from work and you're looking for something to be upset about. Can we revisit this when you're not running on empty?" She wasn't yelling. She wasn't dismissive in an obvious way. She just smoothly, expertly redirected the entire conversation into a referendum on my mental state. And because I was, in fact, tired, I found myself wondering for just a moment if she was right. I let it go. Again. But I stopped letting the incidents pass without noticing them. I started keeping a kind of running count in my head. Not out of resentment, or at least not only out of resentment, but because I needed to know whether I was imagining this, whether it was as persistent as it felt. It was more persistent than I had realized. Within the next 6 weeks, I counted 11 separate occasions where Renata made a comment at my expense to someone else. 11. Some in front of the kids, some in front of her friends, one in front of a contractor who was giving us a quote on replacing the back deck, a man I had never met in my life, who got to hear that I had absolutely no instincts about anything structural or mechanical, which is ironic for a surgeon. The contractor had smiled uncomfortably. I had shaken his hand and gone inside. The breaking point didn't come from a dramatic single incident. It came from Sophie. She was 10. We were driving home from her Thursday violin lesson, just the two of us, and she was quiet in a way that meant she was thinking about something. "Dad," she said, "how come you always mess things up at home but not at work?" I kept my hands on the wheel. "What do you mean? Mom says you're really smart, but you just don't pay attention to things the way she does, like domestically." I recognized the word. Domestically. I recognized the word. Domestically, not a 10-year-old's word. A word she had absorbed from somewhere. "Where did you hear that?" She shrugged. "Mom was telling Aunt Claire on the phone. She said you're not domestic." A pause. "What does domestic mean?" I explained it to her, and then I said, "I want you to know, Safra, I pay attention to you. I pay attention to Marcus. Those are the most important things." She nodded. She seemed satisfied with that. But I wasn't. When we got home, Renata was on the back porch with her laptop. I got the kids started on homework, and then I came back downstairs, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment, and I thought about the conversation I'd had with Renata 6 weeks earlier, and how nothing had changed, and how my daughter was now using my wife's vocabulary to describe her father. And I made a decision. The birthday party was 2 weeks away. Renata was turning 42, and I'd been planning it for a month. Booked the caterer, ordered the custom cake from the bakery she loved, strung lights across the backyard, arranged for her parents to drive up from Savannah. I had done all of it. I wanted to. It was a real effort, and I was proud of it. The party started well. 30 people in our backyard on a warm October Saturday. The lights making everything golden, the kids running around with Renata's college friends' kids. Renata looked genuinely happy. I felt, watching her move to the party, accepting compliments about the decorations and the food. A complicated kind of love, the kind that holds grief in it, because I could see how good we could be. About 2 hours in, a group of us were clustered near the food table. Renata's best friend from college was there, and 2 women from her professional network and her cousin who I'd always liked. Renata was telling a story about a recent client project, and the conversation was easy and warm. Then someone asked how she had managed the party alongside a busy client season. "Oh, I had help," Renata said, smiling and reaching over to squeeze my arm. "Daniel handled most of the planning." A beat. I felt something loosen in my chest. "I have to say," she continued, laughing a little, "I was genuinely nervous leaving it to him. I gave him the caterer's number, and 2 weeks later, I wasn't sure whether he'd actually called or just lost the sticky note. But somehow, it all came together." She gestured at the backyard. "Proof that miracles happen." Everyone laughed, including, reflexively, me. She hadn't said it cruelly. She'd said it fondly, the way you tell a charming story about someone you love. And everyone around us had laughed the way you laugh at a charming story about someone's lovable, well-meaning husband. But something had changed, because the way her cousin caught my eye a half-second after the laugh. A quick, unreadable look told me that someone else in the circle had noticed something I had only recently let myself name. I excused myself. I walked through the kitchen, past the counter where I had spent 3 hours the previous Sunday testing cake flavors because I wanted to get it exactly right, and out to the front of the house. I sat on the front step and I breathed. I had planned this entire party. I had called the caterer, twice, actually, to confirm the allergy accommodations. I had driven to 3 different nurseries to find the specific hydrangeas she mentioned once in passing that she liked. I had coordinated her parents' travel, organized the kids' sleepover at a friend's house so Renata could sleep in the next morning. And the story that made the room laugh was that I'd probably lost the sticky note. I sat on that step for about 10 minutes. Then I went back inside, found Renata between conversations, and said quietly, "I need to talk to you later tonight. Not now, but tonight." She looked at me. Something in my tone registered. "Okay," she said. After the guests left and the kids had been dropped back home and were in bed, we sat at the kitchen table. It was almost midnight. The catering company had already come to collect their equipment. The backyard lights were still on, and they looked beautiful through the window. "I need you to hear something," I said. "And I need you to actually hear it, not manage it." She waited. "Tonight you told that group that you were nervous leaving the party planning to me, and that you weren't sure I'd even called the caterer. In front of your closest friends. On your birthday. At a party I spent a month putting together for you." She opened her mouth. I held up one hand, not harshly. "Just wait. I'm not finished. This isn't about tonight." Tonight was just the night I finally stopped counting and started saying something. For the past 2 years, you had been telling people, friends, family, our kids, strangers in our home, that I'm the lovable screw-up. The surgeon who can't function outside the OR. And I've let it go every single time because each individual thing seemed too small, and I didn't want to fight, and I convinced myself I was overreacting. I stopped. I wasn't overreacting. Renata was very still. 2 weeks ago, Sophie asked me why I always mess things up at home, I said. She used the word domestically. She's 10. She got that from you. The stillness cracked. Something moved across Renata's face that I hadn't seen before. Not defensiveness. Not the practiced patience she had deployed in our previous conversation. Something that looked like the first real reckoning. She said that. Renata's voice was different. She asked me what the word meant. A long silence. Outside, a car passed. The backyard lights made the hydrangeas glow. "I planned to stay at Kevin's tonight," I said. Kevin was my older brother, 15 minutes away. "I'm not doing this dramatically. I'm not punishing you. I just need you to sit with this for a day without me here to manage or redirect. And I need to not be in this house while you're deciding whether what I just said is valid or whether it's me overreacting again." She didn't argue, which was the most significant thing that had happened in our conversation. Every previous attempt I'd made had been met with redirection, with the suggestion that I was tired or stressed or too sensitive. This time, she sat with it. "Okay," she said quietly. I packed a bag, looked in on the kids, and drove to Kevin's. Kevin had known Renata for 15 years. He liked her genuinely. He was not the kind of brother who would validate me reflexively, which was exactly why I called him instead of someone else. He poured me a drink and listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "That's why I'm here. I've noticed this for a while. Not the individual things. I didn't have that context. But at family stuff, Christmas, the kids' birthdays, that trip to the lake last summer, there's a version of you that Renata presents and is not the version I know. The one she presents is smaller." He turned his glass in his hands. I thought about saying something. I didn't know if it was my place. That night I lay in Kevin's guest room and stared at the ceiling and thought about what it meant that my brother had seen it from the outside and said nothing. Not because he didn't care, but because these things are genuinely difficult to name when they're happening slowly, in small increments, with warmth and laughter wrapped around every instance. I stayed at Kevin's for 2 nights. On the second afternoon his phone rang while we were eating lunch. He glanced at it, then at me. "It's Renata," he said. I nodded. He stepped outside to take it. I didn't ask him to, but he went anyway, and I appreciated that too. He was out there for about 20 minutes. When he came back in, he sat down slowly. "She asked me if I thought she'd been unfair to you," he said. I told her yes. She was quiet for a long time. He picked up his fork. Then she asked if I thought you'd come home. I drove home that evening. The kids were at school. Renata was in the kitchen and the house was very quiet. There were fresh flowers on the counter. Not the hydrangeas, just simple grocery store flowers. The kind she bought when she wanted to make the kitchen feel like a home. I noticed them without saying anything. We sat at the island. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I talked to Kevin," she said. "I know. He told me the version of you he knows." She looked at the flowers. "It's the same version I knew when I married you. I don't know when I stopped telling people that version." I waited. "I think," she started, then paused. "I think somewhere along the way I started measuring myself against you. Your career is so visible, so unambiguous. You save people. And I was managing snack schedules and carpool rotations, and it didn't feel equivalent. So I made it feel equivalent by making your contributions at home seem smaller." She looked up. "That's not an excuse. I'm just trying to understand it out loud." It was the most honest thing she had said to me in 2 years, possibly longer. "I need it to stop," I said. With the kids especially. Sophie's already carrying a picture of her father that I didn't give her and didn't authorize. I know. Her voice was unsteady. When you told me what she said, domestically, I kept hearing it all night. She learned that from me. I taught my daughter to see her father that way. She pressed her fingers briefly to her eyes. I'm sorry, Daniel, I mean that. I mean that. I believed her. I'm not going to pretend it gets fixed tonight, I said. But I need to know you understand what it actually cost. Not just between us, the kids. I understand, she said. I do. We didn't hug. We didn't make any declarations. But we sat there at the counter for a long time, and it was the first time in longer than I wanted to count that I felt like she was actually sitting with me rather than managing me from a slight distance. The months that followed were not a clean transformation. Old habits, especially comfortable, socially rewarded ones, don't dissolve because you have one honest conversation. But they can shift, and they did shift, incrementally in ways I noticed. Renata stopped making the jokes, not all at once, but I could see her catch herself. A half-formed sentence would redirect midstream, or she'd glance at me after something came out of her mouth and I'd watch her register it. More than that, she started doing something she hadn't done in years. She started telling the true version to people. At Marcus's fall soccer banquet, someone asked which parent handled the sports logistics. Daniel does, she said. He rearranges his surgical schedule around the games. I'm the one who keeps forgetting the snack rotation. It was a small thing. It landed anyway. She told Sophie that her father was one of the most capable people she knew, that he was good at his work and good at being a dad, and that some of the things she'd said before weren't fair or accurate. Sophie listened with the serious attention of a child, filing her correction in a document she'd been building for years. Later that week, she came to me with a math problem, and the way she sat down next to me, assuming competence, expecting help, was different. I noticed it. I made changes too. I started scheduling 2 evenings a week where I was fully home, phone off, present for dinner and homework and whatever Marcus wanted to show me on his tablet and whatever Sophie wanted to play. Not because I was proving something, but because the conversation had clarified something I had been vague about for too long. Presence was not just the absence of being at the hospital. It required intention. The real marker for me came about 4 months later, at a dinner party at Renata's colleague's house. We didn't know the other couple well. Conversation turned, as it often does, to the particular chaos of family life. The woman across from us made a gentle joke about her husband's inability to navigate their kids' schedules. Everyone laughed warmly. Then she looked at Renata and said, I assume you have the same problem? Renata shook her head. She glanced at me. Just briefly, a moment of private communication. Not really, she said. We've actually gotten pretty good at dividing it. The other woman nodded and moved on to something else. Under the table, Renata's hand found mine. On the drive home, she said, Was that okay? I kept my eyes on the road for a second before I answered. That was more than okay, I said. She looked out the window at the highway lights. I'm still working on it. I want you to know I know that. I know, I said. We drove the rest of the way in the comfortable quiet that is only possible between people who have said the hard thing and come out the other side still choosing each other. I am not telling this story because it ends perfectly. I am telling it because for a long time I convinced myself that the price of keeping the peace was not that high, that paper cuts were not real wounds, and that staying quiet was the same as keeping things intact. It is not. Silence costs something. It cost you the version of yourself your children are building. It cost you the version of your marriage that could have been honest. The night I sat on that front step and let myself name what was happening was not the night things fell apart. It was the night things finally, actually began.